Hello, my name is Bentley Dusablon, and this is my family structure presentation for Dr. in Marriage and Family Therapy for Grandview University. I will be presenting the movie The Judge and the family structure that exists among the father and his three sons in this film. According to Minichin, as cited in Gladding, one of the primary premises underlying structural family therapy is that every family has a family structure, which is an invisible set of functional demands that organizes the ways in which family members interact. All families have a hierarchy of power. In healthy systems, the parent or caregiver holds the authority. They decide what's best for their children, and they work as a united team to instill boundaries. This film does consist of a father and his adult children, but a lot of the structure still plays out. The movie begins with the wife and mother of these three boys passing away so that the Hank, who is estranged from the family, returns home. He ends up having to represent his dad in a legal battle. The film is mostly centered around Hank and Joseph, the dad's relationship, and how dysfunctional it is. So we will get into that shortly. So the hierarchical pattern that exists has Joseph as the authority figure. He's in the place of power. He's the father of the three sons, even though they are all adults. There is Glenn, Dale, and Hank are his three children. Hank is the one Robert Downey Jr. plays, who is estranged but is reunited with his family after the death of his mom. He has a very dysfunctional relationship with his dad, Joseph. There are rigid boundaries in the relationship. Joseph holds all the power. There's hostile communication and there's emotional abuse. The backstory for how their relationship is so dysfunctional has to do with Joseph, the dad, blaming Hank for an accident that happened when Hank was 17. He got in an accident with his brother Glenn, who would have become a professional baseball player. And so the dad holds him responsible for, as he says in the movie, ruining Glenn's career, stealing his future, and crippling him. During this scene, Hank responds to his dad's accusations by saying, "I was only 17. His dad then mocks him. "I was 13, I was 17, whatever your excuses are, they're irrelevant." And this happens multiple times throughout the film where the dad, Joseph, mocks his son, Hank, when he's being vulnerable. So that's part of the reason that I labeled this relationship as emotionally abusive. Another instance in the film that comes up is an argument over a dented bumper in the father's car. And one of the triggers for conflict between Joseph and Hank is Hank coming to the defense of his brothers. Usually when the dad, Joseph, belittles Hank, Hank just stays quiet. He doesn't engage. But when the dad is belittling the two brothers, Hank steps in and engages with his dad. So the dad accused his son Glenn of denting the bumper, and that's when Hank steps up and defends his brothers and says, "This is your bumper. Like, are you sure this wasn't something you did? Most likely you were the last one driving this car. We didn't have anything to do with this." And the dad immediately gets defensive, and instead of responding to what his son's saying, he humiliates him in front of his siblings by bringing up information that he was supposed to know in confidence about the details of Hank's marriage, and vulnerabilities that were going on in Hank's marriage that Hank's mother knew and was not supposed to have shared with the dad. Anyway, he uses this as an opportunity to humiliate his son, which is, again, emotionally abusive. The relationship between Joseph, Glenn, and Dale has more clear boundaries. Joseph treats Glenn and Dale pretty healthily. There's some fusion between Glenn and Joseph, um, and Joseph and Glenn are both caretakers of Dale, who has some developmental delays. So the parent-child dynamic is still like in play here, and it's relatively healthy, especially compared to the relationship between Joseph and Hank. So this is the map of the boundaries that exist between the members of the family. According to Gladding, clear boundaries consist of rules and habits that allow family members to enhance their communication and relationships with one another because they encourage dialogue. Rigid boundaries are inflexible and characterized by power struggles, and diffuse boundaries result in lack of separation between family members and encourage dependence. So between Joseph and Hank, I drew the straight line for rigid boundaries. One example of that in the film is Hank stands up again for his brothers to his dad, saying, "Why do you get to decide what reality is? Why do you get to make all the rules and decide how the world runs?" And his dad Joseph says, "Because this is my house, and that's where I can do this. Go back to your house, and you can be that person in charge." So here, he's basically admitting to having very rigid boundaries and feeling entitled to those boundaries. Conversation is not open about how people should be treated. It's the dad's house, and the dad's rules goes. Between Joseph and Glenn and Dale, his other two sons, he still exerts that power dynamic with them, but they have found a way to exist in a more healthy dynamic where Joseph does have more loving interactions with them than dysfunctional ones. He sets boundaries in a kind way to them. In the beginning of the film, he tells Glenn, have your boys ready for tomorrow, and then gives him a reason why. We need to be on our best game to win this baseball game. So it's a boundary, like what he expects from his son, and then a reason behind it, and love and support. He does the same with Dale about bringing Dale is a videographer, and he tells Dale about he's not allowed to bring his camera to the funeral tomorrow, but he says it in a kind and loving way. So he sets clear boundaries with his two sons, Glenn and Dale, in a loving way. And then he also has a very good relationship with Hank's daughter, Lauren, his granddaughter, which is a bit surprising because his relationship is so poor with Hank, but it is very respectful the way that he does not let any of that seep into his relationship with Lauren or allow her to have any idea of that conflict. So he's a good and healthy grandfather to Hank's daughter, Lauren, and Hank and Lauren also have a good, healthy relationship with clear boundaries. This pops up in the film when Hank is going through a separation and potentially a divorce, and Lauren, his daughter, is young and doesn't fully understand, asks him questions about it, and Hank responds at her appropriate age level. He does not silence any of her questions. He does not redirect. He answers and gives her information that is at her age level of understanding and satisfies her. So it's a healthy relationship and boundary dynamic there. Between Glenn and Dale, there is some fusion. Dale has a developmental delay, so he needs a little extra help and support with day-to-day functions from Glenn and maybe a little bit from his dad, Joseph, as well still. So there is a lot of reliance on Glenn for what to do, what to say, how to think, how to feel, and that creates a bit of diffusion between the two of them. A coalition is an alliance between specific family members against a third family member. A stable coalition is a fixed and inflexible union, such as a mother and son, that becomes a dominant part of the family's everyday functioning. A detouring coalition is one in which the pair holds a third family member responsible for their difficulties or conflicts with one another, thus decreasing the stress on themselves or their relationships. So I drew the squiggly lines between Joseph, the dad, and Glenn, the oldest brother, and then Glenn and Dale. So Glenn and Dale have a stable coalition, like I said in the previous slide. Dale relies on Glenn for a little added help through his day-to-day functioning because of his developmental delays. And so they form a coalition against the dad and against Hank. And it's not super negative. It's just they are kind of like they're a subsystem and they're a coalition to defend each other and help each other out in challenging situations with other family members. The coalition between Joseph and Glenn is a detouring coalition. So this is a coalition where they are teamed up against Hank. Anytime that Hank and Joseph have conflict, Glenn comes to Joseph's rescue. Dad didn't mean that. Or why did you have to do that, Hank? It's not necessarily that Glenn sees, his dad as the good guy and Hank as the bad guy, or maybe it is, but it's more like that desire to get Hank to change, but recognizing that Joseph the dad is never going to change. So this comes up in a scene where they're driving and they get Joseph and Hank get in a fight over the legal battle that they are facing together. Hank stands up to his dad, and the dad gets angry and leaves the car. And then Hank is upset because of his dad's action of leaving the car in the middle of the highway. Seems a little bit overdramatic for just a disagreement that they're having. And Glenn attacks Hank. Why did you have to do that? Even though the dad's actions are the ones that are kind of derailing the situation, he's getting out in the middle of nowhere. It's again Hank's fault. And this happens a second time in the film where there's a tornado siren going and the dad, they're all watching family footage. And something comes up in the family footage that triggers the dad. It's the car accident that we talked about earlier. The dad breaks, acts aggressively, like physically breaks the video recording equipment, yells at his son. And again, Hank steps in because Hank typically comes to the defense of his two brothers. And the dad storms out again into the tornado, so putting his safety at risk. Glenn immediately attacks Hank for that. Blames him for the dad again putting himself in danger. Subsystems exist to carry out various family tasks. Typical subsystems are spousal, parental, and sibling. Some subsystems are temporary, like painting a room, and some are more permanent, like parenting a child. So in this film, the film pretty much exists around or focuses on a temporary subsystem that is formed between Hank and Joseph because Hank is representing Joseph legally. And that is why their estranged relationship has to kind of come back together for this film. The spousal subsystem is disrupted recently because of Joseph's wife passing away. The parental subsystem is still intact. Between Joseph, Glenn, and Dale, he still acts as a father figure toward them. The parental subsystem between him and Hank is disrupted because of the estrangement, hostility, abuse, and then the sibling subsystem exists between the three brothers. So Glenn and Dale, because of the estrangement, Glenn and Dale have their own subsystem. They rely on each other, spend a lot of time together, and work as a team to pretty much help Dale function with his day-to-day life. They also can relate to each other about the dad and how to get along with the dad. And then when Hank comes into town for this film, he does form a sibling subsystem with his two brothers, like we've talked about before. He steps in to defend them regularly against their dad and against other people. There's one scene where Glenn almost gets into a bar fight, and Hank diffuses the situation. So Hank forms a subsystem with his two siblings to come to their defense, to try to give them a good life, and that's it for the subsystems. So finally, here's the overall family map for the movie The Judge. The relationship between Joseph, the dad, and Hank is the center of the focus of this film, and we do get some insight as to why it is so hostile. So spoiler alert and trigger warning because it's pretty intense, but Joseph is a judge in the film, and he decides on a sentence for someone that comes into his court room. For the first time, he gives the kid a minimum sentence. It's a 17-year-old kid who has done something dangerous and hostile to his girlfriend. The dad treats this criminal like he would want someone to treat his son, Hank. So he is projecting Hank onto this court case that he's in, gives him the minimum sentence of 30 days. When this criminal gets out of his 30-day sentence, he goes back and he drowns his girlfriend. So this is a mistake that the dad lives with for the rest of his life, and he projects this mistake onto Hank. He now admits later into the film as seeing this criminal in his son, Hank. And so he was extra hard on Hank, blaming Hank, angry, projecting all his fears and insecurities and hatred onto Hank because of this past mistake he made in his life. So there is a hostile relationship. I drew the squiggly lines for that. There's a period of estrangement in that relationship where they're reconnected for the mom's passing and for the legal case. There is emotional abuse in the form of mocking, humiliation. It's highly controlling, the rigid boundaries where there is no openness to Hank's perspective. Between Hank is married in this film, and there's discord and conflict between him and his wife, Lisa. They are going through a separation. Lisa has cheated on Hank, and there's just discord, conflict, because they are not at all able to understand each other's realities. Lisa feels alone. She feels that Hank is always working, and instead of being able to listen to Lisa about the hardships that she's going through, Hank just blames her. Oh, so that makes it okay for you to cheat on me. So they both feel like the victims here, and they're not willing to understand each other's perspective. Hank and Lauren have a healthy relationship. That's his daughter. This group, Hank, Lisa, and Lauren, are kind of further from the rest of the family because they are estranged until they are reunited for the film. Joseph, Hank's dad, has a good relationship with his granddaughter Lauren and is respectful and follows the appropriate family, like grandfather-granddaughter dynamics, does not involve Lauren or triangulate or put her in any of the drama. Very respectful grandfather. Joseph still acts like a healthy dad to his children, Glenn and Dale. They had, like I've mentioned before, he set clear boundaries with them. I did make a little bit mark for fusion between Joseph and Glenn because Glenn and Joseph scapegoat Hank. So they form that coalition, which I've marked as well, to make Hank the bad guy instead of having to face the unhealthy attitudes and behaviors in Joseph. There's also a stable coalition between Glenn and Dale, and some fusion there due to Dale's developmental delays, like we mentioned. So Dale does rely on Glenn for functioning and is dependent. And that is the end of my presentation, and the reference page will come next.